This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.
Hey, for Flux Sake fans, glaze driving you crazy, clay cracking your soul? Do you just want your ceramics to stop misbehaving? Hi, I'm Rose, and I'm from the Emergency Glaze System. And we've got your back with our brand new Ceramic Materials Workshop Consulting. For just $100, you can get 30 minutes with our team of ceramic superheroes, and we'll help you with fixing your glaze and clay disasters, finding material substitutes, decoding ceramic weirdness like pinholes, crazing, exploding pots, you name it. And we'll even help you tap into killer resources like the UMF tools and our online courses. It's fast, it's fun-ish. It might just save your sanity. Snag your session over at ceramicmaterialsworkshop.com.
Hello, my name is Kathy King, and welcome to the For Flux Sake podcast. I'm coming to you from the Harvard Ceramics program in our fair city, Allston, Massachusetts. I'm here with Rose and Matt Katz of the world-famous Ceramic Materials Workshop, and they are ready to answer your burning questions about clay and glaze. Welcome to Fluxed Up, where we talk to makers about what they do and how they suffer. One thing is true in ceramics. No matter how good you are or how much experience you have, we have all fluxed something up in the studio. So first off, hello, Matt and Rose.
Hey, Kathy.
Hi, Kathy.
And we are so thrilled to welcome Steve Lee to the episode.
Yay!
What's up, gang? Great to be here.
It is good to see you, Steve.
I like to think of myself as the Michael Jordan of fluxing things up, if that's a term I can own.
That's awesome.
That
Yes.
is why we have to have you on the show. I mean, that is intrinsic to everything that you do. You are the king of things being fluxed up.
That's right. It's a state of mind more than anything.
But before we even do that, though, we have to, we don't talk a lot about the show, and so many of you know we've got our producer Ben here who really makes the show go. But many people may not know that actually Steve is the next most important member of the For Flux Sake and Fluxed Up family. And none of us would be here if it weren't for Steve.
Mm-hmm. Got us off the ground.
So you're responsible for this mess.
Or maybe held you back from other accomplishments. I don't know.
We left the nest and wobbled away.
Yeah, but for those of you who don't know, Steve helped to found the Brickyard Network, which he and Ben crafted. They're the actual ones who built the foundation that we're on. So Steve is the former director of the Archie Bray Foundation, and he and Ben put it together. I don't know if you guys got stories or gossip, except that two smart men sitting around with great ideas. But
Well, I think like a lot of things, just, crazy ideas were born out of COVID, like sitting home, twiddling your thumbs, trying to figure out how to, get through the next day. And I think, Ben and I just had been talking about things like this. We I think just wanted to start a Bray podcast, and I was asking him advice about it since he had so much experience. And then it's like that little hair gets in there. It's like, I wonder what would happen if we started our own network and had all these potters who are sitting at home, trying to find things to listen to for hours and hours on end, myself included, having burned through every episode of This American Life ever made,
Right? Yeah.
Like, well, maybe we can create some content that would be interesting. So, you guys are like at the top of our list. Like, wouldn't it be awesome to have like a really high level but very accessible, consumable, technical show about all the mysteries and the craziness about ceramic materials and processes. So I was so happy that you guys are on board, and I think it's just been amazing to watch your success, throughout this whole journey.
The impact is amazing. I mean, that's the scary part of as you said, being in people's ears and spending time with them. And we were all at NCECA not too long ago, and it was crazy.
It was
Of
crazy.
hundreds of people coming up and telling us that they know us from the show and
That's
how
so cool.
disappointed they are to meet us in real life.
No, they did not say that.
Like, oh, you're really tall.
Your voice doesn't sound tall.
I get identified in a room just from my laugh, apparently. And so
That's great.
Yeah, that's a good thing. That's a good thing.
And seek a celebrity. I love it. It's great.
Celebrities. That's what we call it.
Celebrities.
Well, the first time we did the NCECA podcast room was in Cincinnati. And I think this is when I saw, because see, Steve, I wasn't telling them how many people were listening. I was just saying, like, it's going well. So
Yeah.
we show up in
We never
Cincinnati.
asked. We assumed it was a failure.
Yes. We assumed like 5 people were listening to it, and they were probably my family.
Well, what's crazy is that the room in Cincinnati, quickly we realized it was way too small. And the fire marshal, we had about 200 people in there, and the fire marshal came in, and it was so packed that we had to like ask people to leave.
Wow.
And that's when I saw the look in their faces, like, oh, whoa, oh no.
I'm out of here.
People were escorted from the room, and I quietly took my coat and left like I was asked to.
I said, am I even getting paid?
They're like, no, you guys don't leave. You're part of the show.
I'm usually the one
okay.
who's asked to leave. So
Well, great. Well, let's pivot to your amazing work in studio practice. And just for the listeners, Steve, if you would just give us kind of a 101 of what kind of clay you use, firing temperature, what kind of work you make.
So I'm still kind of like more, I think I'm a traditionalist at heart. I still fire to cone 10 reduction. I primarily work in porcelain, sometimes dabble in the dirty stoneware clay bodies, just so I can feel myself getting my hands a little dirtier. And over the years, I think coming out of undergrad is when I started to first work in porcelain, at the suggestion of Linda Sikora, who was my instructor at the time. And I just loved the kind of response to it, the feel, the smoothness, the color response, I think, with the glazes. So that's really what I'd worked with primarily as a functional potter for many years. And then in graduate school, I started to explore a bit more into like sculptural spaces and different avenues, and kept the sort of interest in porcelain as a material for many different reasons, like the sort of economic impact that it's had, in different cultures around the world. And then just even at a base level, like I loved how it's so pliable in the kiln, and it just like will warp and melt, and it's very responsive to all the conditions like the heat, gravity, things like that. So it's been a lifelong obsession, I guess, with this very specific material, and it continues to just keep me, coming back for more punishment every time I open that kiln.
well, but the thing, and people like, don't pause the podcast, keep listening, but open up Instagram or just Google Steve's work, because it is particularly special because it's amazing and so well made. But a lot of the work that you make is based on that tension and on that failure. That it is watching pots fail.
I've thought a lot about this, obviously, and I think the thing that was always so intriguing to me, and I think you guys are very well equipped to speak to this, is that when you look at our field and you think about ceramics, right, it's this genre of art that's bound only by material, right? But then the output of that can be so varied, across the spectrum of things that can be made. But, when I was in school, like I just always found that, education was always trying to pigeonhole us into specific areas. Like You can be a potter, you can't be a sculptor. You can't do both, right? You have to choose. Or, the one thing that always really got me was that the standards of, the final piece were very consistently applied across the board. So, for example, like if you have a little crack in the base of a pot, it's the same as if you have a crack in the base of a figurative sculpture, right? Like it has to make it through the whole process completely unscathed from beginning to end, which we know in ceramics is like virtually impossible most of the time. You're just sort of praying that that can happen. And I always thought that like in hindsight, I kind of feel like what happened was that the standards of industry that related to making pottery, and that are very high for a good reason, right? Because it's for public use. They were also being applied to artistic objects, but I don't know why, and they just were, right? That's just the way that it was when we were in school and maybe still today. But I wrestled with that a lot. Like just as I was in grad school, I kept asking that question. It's like, why is it that we all have to try to like adhere to the standard, equally? Because I think each situation is different. Every situation is unique, different characteristics for different context, if you will.
The pressure is real. I mean, as we can say as people that teach about glazes professionally, that like I think that some of the pressure is self-inflicted.
Oh, definitely.
But like for glazes, like I can say outright, like glazes make people nervous, and you get so much like tension in people because they are afraid because the raw material doesn't look like the fired thing. But then even more so when you talk about functional uses and like, is it going to go in the dishwasher? Are people going to be eating off of it? And then all of a sudden people are responsible for chemistry. And that, like, I really think puts people into like a total like fear lockdown when it doesn't have to be that way. Absolutely, you have to be sensible. But honestly, like from a glazes perspective, like the fact that basically most people don't use lead anymore and sort of eliminates a lot of toxicity issues, and that it just takes a level of freedom to accept what you're doing, and that's the step that you've taken in your work that is so mind-blowing and enrapturing about what you're doing.
Yeah, and I think the thing too that I want to make sure is clear is that I don't advocate that like people just stop paying attention to trying to do like to craft, and like understanding or even an attempt to master like their material, because I think it shouldn't be like flippant. It shouldn't just be like, oh, well, I'm just going to accept every stupid thing that happens in the studio. It's like you want to build it based on knowledge, right? So like for me, I feel I do take a certain amount of pride is that like I work really hard to try to understand like what this material does and how, how it's contextualized in history and all that. But then that makes letting it kind of have its own personality to reveal something completely different. It creates so much more tension with that, right? Because I'm trying really hard to make this stuff look, like very well crafted, very thoughtful, but then allowing it to fail or warp or kind of collapse in the kiln does, I think, increase that, that feeling that you get about like, oh my gosh, it should look like this, but now it looks like this, right? So that's the kind of response I really enjoy when I get to interact with, the audience about the work.
That can't be undersold enough, because I mean, whenever you're in the arts, you get the classic of, oh, a pot that's got a big hole in it and it's fallen over. Like my kid could do that. But the real answer is like you are an exquisite potter. Like we've got some of your pots and like they're so well made. And you've spent the time understanding that perfect balance and thickness and surface and the tension of making things well. And it's that classic, it's a cliche as an artist, but like you go and look at Picasso, and he was a master portrait painter before he started doing, his cubist work. And that process of understanding why things work is absolutely foundational to understanding why they don't work.
Yeah, like every crack can't be filled with gold. It has to have.
Okay. Dear Lord,
Yeah.
thank you.
You have to have some thought behind it. Even though I do it sometimes too, but I try to have it make sense.
Well, that's okay. It's just like anytime on Instagram you see somebody with a crack or, saying something went wrong, people go like, Kintsugi, Kintsugi, Kintsugi. And it's like, oh, for goodness sakes.
And actually, Matt, you brought up, I use Picasso as an example a lot because I think, like, I remember thinking that in school. I'm like, well, I can't be Picasso. I mean, who can be Picasso, right? Like, it's just so much pressure to try to be this, like, once in a lifetime master of something. So it's like, okay, but I think it let me really have the license to just say, okay, well, then who am I? How do I make the work speak more to my experiences, my abilities, and not feel like I have to also be some master of something that I'm not. It's like what are the things that I can master in my own skill set and life experiences? And that was very helpful and just in terms of like relieving some pressure about imagining what success might look like, and that
Mm.
I think it's a constant pursuit.
The freedom to do what you do well is one of the hardest things that I had to overcome as a maker, and to just be confident in that, because like you were talking about sort of being in school, and we went through the same educational programs, and like, boy, I'll tell you what, I started off making pots, and then I started following. I was just trying to rip off Kathy because she was amazing and she was a hero of mine back then. But like, I started to get into sgraffito and decoration, and the pots really became less about the pots and more about the narrative. And I had faculty push back. I'm like, no, we don't do this. This is not. This is not the pottery conversation. And I was just like, well, but no, I want to do this. Like and to be able to go like, this is where my head is at, and this is what I want to explore. And it might not be your thing, and you might be my faculty member, but that doesn't mean that you're right.
When I look at all of you, honestly, I see like you've all like found this beautiful way to your lane using all of your experiences and skill sets to get there, so it's like Matt and Rose, I've known you guys since under or grad school, right?
Yeah.
And like,
Yeah.
and here you are like as at the top of this kind of like technical expertise using all of that experience that you've had as artists, right? And then Ben's that got, this amazing podcast that just came from him liking to have conversations
Hmm.
about clay, right? And Kathy, I
Hmm.
heard your whole thing about like I wanted to be a wood fire potter, and then I
Yeah.
was making all these like prints and drawings, and like then your work, sort of emerged into this like beautiful narrative space. So it's so great.
Humble brown potter. Not.
We all wanted to be that at one point.
I know,
Did.
right? I always say, and 7 golden retrievers at my studio in the
Oh.
woods in New Hampshire. Yeah.
New Hampshire, eh?
Well, actually, yeah, I used to always make that joke. And Matt and Rose, you are in the woods in New
We are in the
Hampshire.
woods.
We are. Although we don't have golden retrievers, we have basset hounds.
We have basset hounds.
To each their own. To each their
Yeah. But it is that cumulative experience thing. And that I am shocked to this day of that, how much I use every single skill that I studied when I was a kid, whether it's going back to just like high school English class, or the fact that both Rose and I, our sort of sub medium was photography. And we do so much work with photography and video to this day. And that I wouldn't be in ceramics if I wasn't spending the time back when I was a student of wood fire and soda fire and high temperature and low temperature and slip casting. And like, eventually you sort of filter to where your interests are, but that breadth of experience is so valuable. And that's the thing I worry about the youngs these days, all the young people, of whether they're getting that diverse experience, whether they're too much in their own lane. But it's different ways of learning. But I certainly appreciate the diversity.
Yeah.
Yeah. And for me, for just to see the industrial space that's out there for ceramics is such an eye opener, and to share what I have learned from that is awesome. Like to just talk about it on the podcast is great, and then to talk about it in other spaces is pretty. It's amazing for me. Like I take it for granted sometimes. Like, oh yeah, it's just this, but people don't know that because you didn't have the experience in industry. Pretty cool.
Well, I have a question for you, Steve. So I think of your work, as really the best example between, vessel, but sculpture and, work that exhibits like such a high degree of craft, but still, a conceptual forefront, I guess. And this past year, I was involved in being a juror for NCCA's Emerging Artists, and it was like shocking at how few potters had applied. I think it was like maybe five and under.
Wow.
And it was funny when I was writing my juror's statement, I was like, oh, I wonder what other people have read. And I found like one of Julia Galloway's from like 10 years earlier, where she said, where are the potters? Why aren't they applying? And so, just from your background in overseeing an organization that served artists as well as your work and maybe what you're seeing in the field, what's up with that?
It's a really good question. And I think that is a similar experience we had at the Bray. Like we would see over the years, like there were just less potters applying, or I would say potters whose pots were accomplished, or had a certain potential in them. Honestly, I think a lot of it has to do with like the whole structure, I think, of our field is it's just shifting, as we are experiencing it. And I think one of those things is that a lot of academic programs are starting to move away from the kind of rigors that you need to teach in order for people to become good at pottery, which is
Right on.
a lot of time, a lot of repetition, a lot of practice. And I can see why in certain cases, there are some schools that have very much committed to that, like Utah State and Logan, right? Like they have a very like strong program related to vessel. But then schools like, I don't know, like UCLA, like probably don't care so much about it. So that's a big thing. And then it feels like, I'm sure you all have seen this, that pottery's really become more comfortable in like the social media space, right? So like
Oh,
over the
yeah.
Good
during the
point.
pandemic, ceramics blew up, right? Like on Instagram and TikTok. And I was in New York not long ago, and they were saying that like pottery studios across Manhattan are just like popping up left and right, and they're all full, right? But then the thing I think is really interesting about that is that when I look at a lot of those Instagram videos, I'm never seeing the finished work. I'm only seeing the process.
Right.
Like 99% of the time, it's like really cool throwing videos, or I mean, it's
Hmm.
mostly that, right? Just throwing videos, which is always magic, right? We all were enamored by seeing things grow on the wheel organically. But I feel like that's where the gap is, that like actually executing to the end, you know, like taking the feedback of the finished work from the consumer, going back, making changes, like that whole process, it's a long journey, but I think that's maybe kind of going away a little bit. Or maybe it's just existing in a different space than the NCCA based like ceramics field. I don't know. I mean,
Right, right. Yeah,
Mm.
I just had a conversation with a professor who I will not name of a, well-known program, and they were talking about making their choice for their new incoming assistant professor position. And I said, well, how about that person who, they teach throwing, I know. And, the response was, well, I really don't want to see people making cups and teapots. We want to, if the wheel
Oh.
is there, it's got to be to make, to be used as a tool to make more sculptural, conceptual parts. And I was like, oh my God.
uh,
I was like, please teach them how to actually use the tool then. If that's your end game, like have solid, beginning to intermediate wheel throwing classes. Like, why is this wrong? Because I do, as you said, that rigor, I do think that teaches people how to schedule themselves, how to walk through the very long process from getting to the wheel to trimming to drying to firing and all that. But we could go
absolutely.
on and
I
on.
mean, I think of that a lot as just craftsmanship as a term, which sometimes has like negative connotations, like it's because it's craft and art, whatever. But to me, craftsmanship is like committing to seeing something through, right? To the best of your ability and practice, right? So that could be through the physical, like in the material. But I feel like it also should apply to the conceptual end of it. If you're making sculptural work, it's like, what does it look like if you're committed to the end, and you're not going to stop until you get there? I mean, I think that's what trying to become a good potter is that I'm just going to keep doing this until I get really good at it. And even then, I'm going to try to keep getting better at it, And that is a craft. Like it takes time, and there's no real replacement for it. And I think, I don't know, I'm just still like in my head in grad school, right? It's like potter or sculptor, you can't be one, you got to choose. And now what I think is cool is like, you could do both, you could do whatever you want, right? It doesn't matter, but the impact is you're spending less time in one or the other area. That's a real thing, I think. So if you want to make sculpture and pottery, it means you're going to be spending less time making pottery when you're making sculpture. So like there is a give and take, I think, but if you're willing to accept that, I think that's your choice.
Well, the harder thing for ceramics, and we've all been in this medium for decades now. And there's always the art versus craft debate, and it's a pointless debate. But the thing is about ceramics, it's inescapable no matter what you make, is that process matters. And it matters in a way that does not make as much of a difference for other medium. A painter, yes, you can put paint on a canvas, and yes, there's some skill to getting a particular level of representation. But at the end of the day, like the big twist right now is everybody with the AI generated images of like the AI generates the image really cool, and does it matter how it's painted? But for ceramics, we are going through this technical process, and there's no way around it. For all everybody wants to know about, wants to get, all hot and bothered about the pottery bots. I'm one to tell you, pottery bot, not going anywhere. That the resolution's too low. No, but like you can use 3D modeling for ideation and you can print forms, but you have to slip cast it. Like I had a friend who worked for a very big 3D printing company, and their whole deal was they'll 3D print in any material, and they ran the ceramics division of this company. And their dirty secret was they were printing molds that they were slip casting into because you can 3D print plaster pretty easy. But they acted like, oh, we're 3D printing clay. No, they 3D printed a slip casting mold, and then they just plain old slip casted into it. And so you still have the clay and the mold and the firing and all that process coming into it. And for ceramics, that you just cannot get around the process, no matter what you're making. Literally, this show is a process show. We are never about the finished results. We are about getting people through the parts of their process that they struggle with.
Yeah, I think maybe we are safe from computers taking over the world, or we could still our job might be safe. I don't know. I think you're
Oh my
right,
God,
though.
if there's a robot Matt, we're in trouble.
You can't teach this level of sarcasm and failure.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, I think so.
I'll just be throwing mugs at the Terminators when they come after us.
But we are here. Fluxed Up is here to talk about the failure. So I don't know if we really drove home of what your sculptural work, for lack of a better definition, is. You make pots fail. You sort of take classic forms, and you push them to the extreme, and that's and let's be clear, everybody. Like Steve is in the Smithsonian and is in like the greatest collections out there from making pots fail. So can you talk to us a little bit about where that comes from, how you make them fail? Sort of take us through making the work.
Well, I'd say the beginnings, kind of referencing what I talked about before, is like when I was making pottery full time, right? Like I was always really questioning this whole idea of like what a flaw was, and I have this very distinct memory when I was an undergrad at Alfred. Steve Godfrey, who was like a grad student, he was like, we all looked up to Steve. We thought he was awesome. He's great. And he had a firing, and then there was one of his cups he put in the dumpster, and my buddy and I, Dave Diley, we found it, and we're like, man, look at this cup. This is awesome. Nothing was wrong with it. So we go up to him and we're like, hey, Steve, check out this cup. Like, can we have it? And he just took it and he threw it against the wall and it shattered into a million pieces. And I'm like, what the heck what's up with this guy? And it just wasn't meeting whatever expectation he had in his head, which is his ability. That's totally fair, right? But that always stuck with me. And I thought about that a lot, just making pots. Like I'd have a pot that had, maybe a little crawl at the handle, but it still functioned. It was still very beautiful. It still had everything else in its identity that I wanted, except for this like one thing that was just like, okay, now it goes from a value of up here down to zero, So that gap I always thought was like, gosh, how is it that in this field, like we can go from like top to bottom so quickly based on just the smallest thing? And then, when I got to grad school, I actually got in as a potter. I was making pots, and then I started to just explore other things and making kind of weird objects. And that question just kind of kept sticking with me. It's like I was always fighting what in my brain was set as a level of expectation against the reality of what would happen, and like contending with that. Like, oh, okay, this looks very different than what I thought, but does that mean that it has no value, or does it mean I have to shift my perspective around what's actually happening in real time, Um, and the the one point that happened when I was in grad school, I had this like, of course, I had a review coming up, midterm review, and I had this idea for a piece, right? So I was going to throw these very tall porcelain cylinders that were maybe about 6 inches wide and probably 4 feet tall, and I was going to make a line of them, right? So it would be like a screen of these cylinders, and then I projected an image of an old like uh, I don't know, Middle Eastern pattern across it in cobalt. And I just thought it would be this very beautiful, 2D, 3D kind of thing. So I put this thing in the kiln. And then what happens when you throw tight cylinders? Like they want to unwind a little bit, right? So these like 8 cylinders that I put in the kiln, when I opened it up, they had all untwisted and fell into each other and turned into this like mass of porcelain and glaze and cobalt. And this was like the night before my review, which of course, like we're all up against the deadline. And I looked at it, I'm just like, well, I don't have any more options here. So I pulled this thing out of the kiln, which was all like fused together in like one huge
Oh
mass, probably weighed
no.
like 250 pounds. And then I just figured out how to get it on a table. And that was the piece that we were going to talk about with all the, professors and the students and everything. And it actually went really well, because it was again like I didn't have any other options. This is what happened. And it just was like the difference between what I thought was going to happen versus what really happened was actually much more beautiful than what in my little brain could conceive. Right. So, like, that was the beginning of just kind of getting me on this path of like, being open to other possibilities and then learning how to either embrace them or follow them down to their natural end.
The embracing of failure, the the is by far, in my experience, the most important thing I've ever been through educationally, of being like, it's okay to fail. It is okay. It's good to fail, and to see why you failed, and then to understand how to change to make it better, to accept that and grow from it. And I think it's something that doesn't get talked about a lot because we all like feel like secret shame from failure. But it's okay. Like, like I'll try to make fun of myself on the show, being like, no, I screw up more than anybody. Like, I always say I've ruined more glaze tests than most people have ever made. But like it is
Yeah.
hey.
Oh, I've seen a lot of it. That's why I said that.
I'm the worst. I am the worst glazer in the workshop by far. But yeah, in your work, that is so profound to embrace it. So let's get down to, how do you make some of these things fail? Are you just throwing until it collapses? Are you putting in some sort of a failure mechanism? Are you just putting ruined pots into the kiln? Like where do you try to force the failure and that you're sculpting it, or where do you trying to embrace the failure?
It takes different forms sometimes, or like there are times where you know, I guess to start, like, right now, the work that I'm most known for are, these vessels that are based on traditional forms throughout history. So they're kind of like archetypes of different form, like from different cultures around the world. So, for example, like Joseon Dynasty in Korea, which is a very like prolific period for making beautiful ceramics and porcelain. That's one I've been very obsessed with. So I'll make these jars, and typically throw them in sections. And I'm trying very hard to make them look like very close proportionately, in terms of technique and everything. And So I'll make these pots and then sometimes they'll have decoration or imagery on the surface of it. And a lot of them I will actually, when they're, I've gone through the whole process of making the piece, doing all the drawing and inlay. And then the last thing I do before it gets bisque is I have to like breach the tension of the form. So that might happen in different ways, but a lot of times I'm just sort of like creating a crack or like some sort of a fissure in the work, but enough that it'll stay together so that I can get it in the kiln. And then once it comes out of the bisque, I'm glazing it and then putting it back in the kiln at that much higher temperature where the material becomes subject to more movement, more warpage, more intensity, from the firing. And, then gravity comes into play and like kiln furniture and kiln wash and, hitting other things. So like that part becomes the real dance. Sometimes it comes out and I'm like, that looks great. And sometimes it comes out and I'm like, uh-oh, like I need that, like I'll just kind of shelve it and then I'll come back to it later, and then maybe 6 months later I'll have an idea on how to keep pushing it forward. So for me, I do try to like just say like there is no end point. I'm just going to keep going, until I come to a place where I feel satisfied with it.
Okay, this is the really weird question. How much of the work that you put, and again, like everybody should check out the work because it's so exquisitely decorated and so wonderfully glazed and thrown. But how much of the work that you make is too much of a failure to represent the failure that you're trying to expose?
Oh, that's a great question.
That's a good question. Not many. I mean, I really do. I do just kind of keep things. I keep everything until like I think of something else that might make sense. I mean, I had this one piece where I decided I wanted to make like a scaled up version of one of these like porcelain jars. So I coil built and threw this like really huge jar. It's probably like 4 feet tall, and uh, and the same material, same everything, same clay. But the way the clay reacted at that scale, like shifted completely from what I was used to, right? So I put it in the bisque and it was totally like intact, came out of the bisque, and every coil that I had attached had cracked. There's a huge crack in it, right? So that was different. It was big enough where I had a hard time handling it myself and I had to get other people involved. But I figured out how to glaze it. I put it back in the kiln, and then the whole thing just imploded in itself. So you couldn't even recognize it anymore. It was just like laminated strips of fired porcelain. So I just put that on a shelf for like 6 months. And then during that time, I was just thinking about it. And then eventually I had this show where I figured out like it was kind of interesting because that was the first piece where the parts were like some fell where you can only see the inside and some fell where you could see the decoration on the outside, but they all were fused together. And I kind of liked that you were looking at inside and outside and you kind of could see the form. So I just like recomposed it using like epoxy, and then I thought it made sense having it up on a wall. So I had to figure that out, like engineering it so that you can hang it on like metal plates and then have it more in like a landscape, orientation on the wall. And that piece is like really, I love that piece so much, but it kind of happened out of a series of circumstances that I don't even know if are repeatable. It's just what it is now. And the Portland Art Museum has that piece in their collection, so I can go see it, if you're ever in the area.
Well, and then so since you've retired, though, you've also been traveling. Not retired, I mean, like you're still making from retired
He's
from the Archie
retired.
Bray.
Woohoo!
I know, retired at this age. But no, but
Young chicken.
since you're not at the Bray anymore, you've been traveling a lot more. How have you found is working in other studios and with other materials? Does that make it harder? Does the material feel the same? Is it, what's the experience moving around?
That's a great, like it's so hard to do like residencies for short periods in a new country, right? Because like everything's different. The tools are different. The materials are different. The way people navigate the space is different. It's like you're just always trying to figure out, how do you keep things progressing? And I did get to do this amazing residency in Gwangju, South Korea, last spring, and just about a year ago. And it was really interesting because it was an exhibition, but they wanted you to make a couple pieces like so they partnered with Chosun University. So there were like 3 or 4 of us, including Linda Lopez and then an artist named Seo. And we all just worked there for different periods. But yeah, like we had to go to the ceramic supply shop and that guy was like super grumpy. So then we kind of were trying to figure out like what's real, what's not real. And then you have translators and all this stuff. But I just went into it thinking, I can't control much of anything. So I'm just gonna go. I had a concept of a piece I wanted to make, and I was just gonna sort of like let it happen, right? And I was very pleased with it. I brought some materials with me, like a glaze, and then a friend in Korea let me borrow some clay that I was used to. But it was a really fascinating experience, to just kind of let yourself be free of the anxiety of of a specific outcome and just kind of letting it ride. And I think the piece turned out great. And the experience working with everybody was like probably the most memorable and special part of it, outside of all the amazing, delicious meals that I ate and recorded my whole time there.
Traveling is about eating.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, I was posting my stories every day of like all my meals, and then most people were like, "Oh, if you have a story about ceramics, I just swipe past it, but I'm just looking for the food stories,
Well, just a little quick departure, Steve. For one of the moments at NCECA, our clay conference that we had in Salt Lake City that I enjoyed the most was your piece that was in the National. And it seemed it was such a moving piece. And if you could just talk about that a little bit and how this is a bit of I don't know if it is a departure in your mind from your normal work.
Well, I appreciate that. Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, so that piece was one that I'd made. I had a solo show at Dwayne Reed Gallery, and it was around the 2-year anniversary of the Atlanta spa shootings, which was a kind of a mass shooting in Atlanta that was pretty specifically targeted towards Asian American women. There were 8 people killed in total, 6 of whom were women of Asian descent. And I think it felt like we had been through so many series of mass shootings, and then it was just like, oh, here's another one that happens to be around Asian women, But I think that event, as tragic as it was, it kind of it rallied the like Stop Asian Hate movement. It really helped to mobilize a lot more advocacy around a lot of the crimes or hate crimes that were being seen against Asian Americans after COVID. And honestly, I wanted to learn more about it too, and just kind of dig into like who these women were and their journeys as immigrants to come to this country in hopes of like a better life for their families, and just a lot of misinformation around the what those spas represented and what kind of work they did, or whether they did it or not, and whether it even matters, And so that was a piece that I made. I like the idea of creating like a commemorative portrait, for each of them, and then having a physical object representing like their story, and their journey. So that piece, I've had the ability to show that, and that's really the goal for me, is like just having it as more of an educational experience. So I showed it at the Korea Society in New York, and then it traveled to South Korea for the Biennale in Icheon. And then when Judith was in New York, she came to the opening, and she wanted to include it in the show here at NCECA. So that's kind of the hope for it, is I can just kind of keep moving that into different spaces and helping people understand more about the context of what that event represented.
That's great. And anybody who's listening, if you do want to see a photo of it, you can go to Stephen's Instagram account, Stephen Y. Lee, and be able to see that. But I just thank you so much, Stephen, for being with us today. This is incredible. You gave us so much time. I feel spoiled, downright spoiled.
Well, I just feel like I'm talking to a bunch of buddies like in
You are.
like at
Oh,
NCECA
yeah.
or something.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's
But
been
with
really
less cocktails, yeah.
I know, we should fix that for next time.
It's an honor for us, not just as the person that helped to get all this off the ground, But, like I remember being an undergrad and having you around as a grad student and being a big inspiration and looking at the people who came before you that, like the same way you're saying of Steve Godfrey, of like seeing this thing and like there's that little trigger and you were always really impressive to me. And so I'm honored to know you as a friend and to have you on the show. And yeah, that is a real pleasure. Just to know that you're out there, Steve.
Well, I thank you. I feel the same about all of you. I'm just so like impressed with everything everybody's doing and inspired, now that I am kind of on my own. Like I just keep looking around thinking like, man, everybody's doing like such a great job in their areas and you just want to aspire to that. I do have, well, I have you guys. 'Cause
Yeah.
Ben told
Ooh.
me that I could ask a potential question. And
Oh,
Do it.
okay.
when I have technical issues, like you're my go-to, right? Matt and Rose. It's like,
Yeah.
We talk.
Yep.
I don't know what's going on. So this happens to me periodically. Okay, so if you can see the bottom of this pot stuck to the silicon carbide shelves, right?
Mhm.
Just the edges, right? These
Yep.
little like bits,
Yeah.
right? And my assumption is that like there's some kind of soluble material that's leaching through the foot that's like creating a glaze on the foot, and which, I think that's what's happening. Usually have to diamond grind this stuff down to a smooth level, but any thoughts on how to like get around there? Are there ways to try to like avoid that? Because it doesn't happen every time. It just I'd
What's
say like,
the word for that? Picking?
It's
Is that it?
Plucking.
Plucking. That's it.
oh,
That's
there's
it.
a word for it.
There
Yeah.
is.
Okay.
They did
Plucking.
you did a YouTube thing on it, right, Rose? Yeah.
Yep. And it's a soluble material, probably sodium, that reacts with the silicon carbide shelf and just sticks ever so slightly. Yeah, and it's not all the time. It's not like the whole kiln load. It's here and there.
The silicon carbide is the funny part because like those of you who work with cordierite shells, which are the sort of heavy yellow shells, it doesn't really happen all that much to.
Well, it could
But
still happen though.
It
still
can, but
does. Yeah.
it's much more common on the silicon carbide because what's happening is there is sodium and it can be from a couple of places. NephSi or a sodium feldspar in the glaze is usually the most common. Or what tends to make it much worse is if there's nepheline cyanide in the clay body. That those materials, they shouldn't be water soluble, but they kind of are. And so the sodium dissolves in water, and then when the water comes to the surface, it'll leave deposits. Now, sometimes people love it because like that flashing is the same effect. It's just a ton of soluble sodium, but when it gets down on the foot, that sodium interacts with the silicon carbide, and silicon carbide, if you flux it, the silicon and carbon break up, and literally the silicon just becomes silica. And so then you literally just form a silica sodium glass, and that's why they stick together. So yeah, watch out for NephSi in the body. I mean, bodies aren't things we have a ton of control over. But if it's consistently a problem, you might want to hit the foot ring with a little bit of green scrubby before you put it into the glaze firing, just to make sure to wear off any of the solubles that may have built up, because you won't see them.
Yeah, and don't use a sponge. Don't do it wet.
Yeah, don't re-wet it. Don't re-wet it.
Don't re-wet it.
That'll
Just use.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
Huh.
Because my initial thought was wax with alumina hydrate in it.
That's what I used, and it's happening to me, and it didn't work. So, yeah, let's not do that.
Yeah, the idea that it would create a barrier layer is good thinking, but it's still basically resting on that shelf because, like, those little alumina nodules, they're just a few, and you're kind of like trying to use like tiny grains as a stilt, and it's not giving you enough of a distance. And so there's not much to do except try to get that sodium off before it goes into the kiln. So yeah, just keep a little dry green scrubby.
Yeah, if you wet it, that's just going to bring more sodium to the surface when it dries. So that's why it's dry. So you take it off.
So even with kiln wash, it's still, because it still happens.
It's still doing it. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah.
For me, at least. Yeah.
Huh. Wow. That I never would have thought of that as a solution. That's awesome.
Yep. There you
I was
go.
getting ready to
Sometimes.
alumina hydrate every pot. I'm just like, oh my God, it's gonna be such a mess and it's so much work.
Mhm.
Too much.
Yeah, that was a gem of a question.
Yeah,
Way to
that's
go.
a good one.
Way to go. Good.
Well, and I can't leave Steve. I have to embarrass you, as I embarrass everyone in my life. I will say that Steve has a skill that is very few and far between. And I don't know if you've kept this up, but I remember Steve is the first and only person I have ever seen throw with their feet.
That's weird. Were you forced to do this?
Now he's
or-
embarrassed.
Oh my God.
Name.
I forgot we did that at Alfred. Well, so the beginning of that was when I was a summer resident at the Bray. And I think Sanam, Imami, and I were like in the studio with some other people, and it came up somehow. It was just like, well, let's give it a try. So we all, like Freddie, Ron, and a bunch of us, we put the thing at the right height, sat on a table, and then we did it. And we're just like, oh yeah, I guess like if you're just using your toes in the same way mechanically as your fingers, like you could throw a cylinder. Like it works, right?
And that's proof there's not a lot to do in Alfred, New York on a Saturday night.
Oh God. Yeah, maybe that'll be a thing. That would take off on TikTok, I think.
There, you want your next viral video. That's
Yeah.
it. Bring it out. I don't know how your flexibility is at our ages, but
That's right. Yeah, I might need a walker.
All right, y'all. Well, that is all the time we have. So until we see each other again, farewell.
bye, Kathy.
Thanks,
Bye, Rose. Bye,
everyone.
Steve.
Bye.
All right, thanks everybody.
Well, folks, that's it for this week's episode of For Flux Sake. I'd like to thank the listeners who submitted questions this week. And if you want your question answered on the show, shoot us an email at ForFluxSakePodcast@gmail.com. So join us next time. And when in your studio, remember what Rose always says.
Always remember to test, test, test. This is a test of the emergency glaze system. Beep.